This is part 59 of Angular CRUD tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss editing and updating data in Angular. To set the expectations right, we'll be updating data only on the client side. We'll discuss persisting data to a database table in our upcoming videos when we implement the server-side service. Now, to support editing and updating data, instead of creating a brand new form for that, we are going to make use of this create employee form. At the moment, we are using this create employee form to create a new employee. We are going to modify this to support both creating a new employee and editing and updating an existing employee. At the moment, to get to create employee component, we use this path segment, create. Notice within the URL, we have that path segment create and we see the create employee form, and we are using this create employee form to create a new employee. Now to support both creating and updating an existing employee, I'm going to change this create path to edit /:id. Notice now this path has got a route parameter. If this ID parameter value is 0, then we're going to use this form to create a new employee. If it's anything else other than 0, then we're going to use this form to update an existing employee. The next step is to update this create menu item. This menu item is within our root component, app component. Notice the menu item is right here. At the moment, we don't have any path that matches create. We changed it to edit /:id. So we need to provide a value for ID parameter. Now we are going to use this menu item to create a new employee, and for the ID parameter we're going to supply a value of 0. So edit /0. Let's save all our changes. Notice now when we click on the create menu item, the path changes to edit /0 and we have an empty form to create a new employee. Now let's navigate to the list page. When we click this edit button, we want to edit this existing employee. So let's wire up a click event handler. The edit button is in display employee component. Notice the button is right here. Let's wire up a click event handler. Let's name the method edit employee. We don't have this method yet, so let's create it within the component class. When the edit button is clicked, we want to navigate the user to edit /the ID of the employee that we are editing. This code is going to be very similar to what we have already within the view employee method. So let's make a copy of this method and then change the bits that are required. The name of the method is edit employee, and we want to navigate to edit path, and we are getting the ID of the employee that we want to edit from the employee object that is coming into this component. We don't need this query parameter, so let's get rid of that. Let's save all our changes and then take a quick look at the browser. Notice now when we click the edit button, the path in the URL is changed to edit /the ID of the employee that we are editing, in this case ID1, but we don't see that specific employee details on this form. That's because at the moment we don't have the code implemented yet to read the route parameter and then retrieve that specific employee and bind it to this create employee form. Let's do that now. So within our create employee component, let's subscribe to the ID route parameter and then react accordingly. To read route parameters, we need Angular's activated route service. So let's inject it using the constructor. Let's name it _route. And the service that we want is activated route service. Next, within ng-on-init lifecycle hook, let's subscribe to the route parameter. This ._route .paramap.subscribe. The callback method that we specify as a parameter to the subscribe method is going to get the parameter map as a parameter. We can name it anything we want. I'm going to call it parameter map, and on the parameter map we can use the get method to get the ID route parameter value. Remember, the name of the parameter that we have specified for the edit path within our root module file app.module.ts is ID, so we have to specify that name right here, and ID is a number. So to convert that to a number, let's use +, and then let's store it in a constant. Let's name the constant ID. and then we are going to pass this ID to a method called getEmployee. We don't have this method yet. We'll create it in just a bit. So this method is going to retrieve the employee with the specified ID. Now let's create this getEmployee method. This is going to be a private method, and it's going to have a parameter. Let's name it ID, and this is of type number. If this incoming ID parameter value is 0, then we are going to use this form to create a new employee. So we are going to initialize the employee property with an employee object where all properties are set to null. We already have that code right here. So let's cut this from here and paste it right here. Now the important point to keep in mind is the view template is bound to this employee property, and notice when the incoming ID is 0, we are initializing all the employee object properties to null or their default values. So the form is displayed with the blank form fields, so we can enter the data of a new employee that we want to create. On the other hand, if the incoming ID is not 0, then we want to use the employee service that's injected into this component and then retrieve that specific employee by ID. So this dot employee property equals this dot underscore employee service dot get employee, and to this method we pass the incoming ID. Notice now on our form we see marked data because his employee ID is 1, but some of the fields here are not populated. For example, phone number is not populated. That's fine because for phone number we don't have data. But look at this contact preference. We have data for contact preference, that's not populated, and gender is also not populated. We'll fix that in just a bit. But before that, let's go to the list route and then try to edit another employee and see what happens. We are now editing Mary. Notice, we don't have email, but the rest of the details are present. When we click edit, we see some of the details, but some of the details are missing. Notice again contact preference and gender. So let's fix this now. If we take a look at employee service where we have all our employees data, notice Mary data is right here. We have data for both these fields, gender and contact preference. Gender is female, contact preference is phone. But if we look at our form, notice both those fields are not populated. That's because if we look at the view template, notice within the view template we have those two radio buttons here, male and female. Look at the value here for the radio buttons. All letters are lowercase, but if we look at the data within our employee service, notice gender has got a capital letter F in female. So because of that mismatch, the respective radio buttons are not selected. So let's fix the value here to include uppercase M and uppercase F here. And the same is true for contact preference. So we have the contact preference radio buttons here. So let's include capital letter E for email and capital letter P for phone. Notice now both the fields contact preference and gender are populated as expected. There's another small issue here. If I select email as the contact preference, and since we don't have a value for email, our required validation error should trigger, but it's not working at the moment. Similarly, if I select contact preference as phone, and if we don't have a value for phone, again it should trigger required validation error. It's not working at the moment. So let's see what's causing this first. Take a look at this phone number field. Notice the required attribute is bound to this Boolean expression. If the contact preference value is phone, then add the required attribute. Now notice within the value here we have a lowercase p, but here the value for phone radio button is capital letter P. So because of that mismatch, this required attribute is not added. So let's change this to a capital letter P, and let's do the same thing with our email field. So again here required attribute is only added if the contact preference value is email. Let's save our changes and take a look at the browser. Notice now our dynamic required validation works as expected. When we select phone and when we remove the phone number, we have the validation error, and when we put the phone number back, the validation error disappears. Now let's go back to the component class. The way we have implemented this else block causes a small issue when updating an existing employee. First, let's understand what that issue is. At the moment, we are editing Mary details. Let's change her name to Mary1, and at this point, let's navigate to the list route. We get our can deactivate card because the form is dirty. So let's click OK. We are on the list route, and if you look at Mary name, notice it is already updated to Mary1. So when we click edit, and if we look at her name, it's already updated to Mary1 without us explicitly clicking this save button. The employee data is automatically updated because this employee property is holding a reference to the employee object in the employee service, and we know this employee property is bound to this form. So when we change any field on this form, the object that this property is pointing to is automatically updated. So when we changed name of employee Mary, the change is automatically made its way into the employee object in the employee service because this property is holding a reference to that employee object. To solve this, we will have to copy the values of the employee object into another object and then assign that object as the value for this employee property, and we do that by using object assign method. So with this code, we are now copying the values of the retrieved employee object into a new object right here, and then assigning this object as the value for the employee property. So now it's not holding a reference to the employee object in the employee service, so the data should not be updated automatically. Notice this page is reloaded. Now let's change Mary's name to Mary2, navigate to the list route, click OK to discard changes. Notice Mary name is not automatically updated. Let's edit again. Notice the name is still Mary. There is another small issue here. When I select my contact preference as email, we get email required validation error, which is fine because we don't have a value for email field. At this point, I want to discard all these changes and then create a brand new employee. So I click on create menu item. So we get the can deactivate alert, which is fine. When I click OK to discard all the changes, the route changes to edit/0, and I'm presented with a blank form so I can enter the details of the new employee that I want to create. But what I don't like here is this validation error from our previous edit form. When a user is presented with a blank form to create a new employee, we also want to reset the validation errors. To reset the form, I'm going to use this create employee form property that we have. So let's use this property and then call the reset method. Now let's quickly test our fix. First, let's navigate to the list route, edit one of the employee details. Let's change the contact preference to email. We see the validation error. Now let's navigate to create a brand new employee. Click OK. Notice now we don't see previous validation errors. Next, let's implement save functionality. When the save button on this form is clicked, this is the method that is called. Notice save employee method is bound to ng submit event. So when the save employee method is called, we are copying all the properties of the object that this employee property is pointing to into another object, and then we are assigning that object as the value for this property. We are then passing that to the save method of our employee service. Now let's take a look at the save method. Now we have to modify the code in this method in such a way, if the incoming employee object is a new employee, then we want to add that employee to this list. If the employee is an existing employee, then we want to replace that employee within this list. So the question now is, how do we differentiate between a new employee and an existing employee? Well, if we take a look at our create employee component, notice for a new employee, the ID property is set to null, whereas for an existing employee, ID property will have a value other than null. So if employee.id is null, then we know it's a new employee and we want to push that employee into the array. Else, we want to replace the existing employee. First, let's find the index of the existing employee object in this list employees array. For that, let's use find index method. given an employee object such that the ID of the employee object must be equal to the incoming employee object ID. Let's store the index in a constant. I'm going to name it found index. Now all that is left to do is replace the employee object at the found index with the incoming employee object. Another important thing that we need to do is specify a value for this ID property of the new employee object that we are pushing into this employees array. To compute a value for this ID property, we will have to first identify what is the current maximum ID value, add 1 to it, and then assign it as the value. There are several ways to find maximum ID value in this list employees array. One way is by using reduce method. As the name implies, this reduce method reduces the array to a single value. We provide another function as a parameter to this reduce function. This provided function is executed for every element in the array from left to right. And to this function, we pass two employee objects. Let's call them E1, E2. And then we'll specify the logic on how to reduce this array of employees into a single value. In our case, a single employee object. So here we are comparing ID property value of both the employee objects, and if the ID value of E1 is greater than E2, then return E1, else return E2. So this function will be executed for every employee object in this list employees array from left to right. After it completes execution, we are going to get that employee object which has got the maximum ID value. So let's retrieve the ID property value from that employee object and let's store it in a constant. Let's name the constant max ID. Finally, before we push the employee object into the array, let's set its ID value. So the ID property value equals max ID plus 1. Now let's test our create and edit scenarios. First, let's create a new employee. Notice we have our new employee, Tom, successfully created. We have all his details, gender, date of birth, contact preference, etc. captured correctly. Now let's try to edit this employee and see the ID value assigned to him. Notice the ID value in the URL, it's 4. That's because within our employees service, in the employees array, we've got 3 employee objects and the maximum ID value is 3. So our save method has added 1 to that max ID value, hence we got the ID value as 4 for this new employee object that we have just added. Now let's try to change these employee details and see if it works correctly. Now let's change email to tom1@presumetech.com and name also to tom1, and let's change his contact preference to phone. Let's click save. The changes are saved and notice name is updated to tom1, his contact preference is phone, and his email is also changed to tom1. Now another small issue that we have is within our create employee component. Notice the panel title is hard-coded to create employee. So whether we are creating a new employee or editing an existing employee, the title is always displayed as create employee. Now we want to dynamically set this. So I'm going to bind this to a property. Let's call the property panel title. And within our component class, let's create this property. This is of type string. Next, we need to set this property dynamically. We know we'll be creating a new employee if the ID route parameter value is 0. So let's set here the panel title to create employee. If the route parameter value is not 0, then we know we'll be editing an existing employee. So in this case, let's set the panel title to edit employee. Let's save our changes and quickly give it a test. Now, one important point to keep in mind is all this data is saved in memory in the application. This means anytime the application is reloaded, we lose all the changes. Notice we lost the newly added Tom employee object. Similarly, any changes that we make to these existing employees, we will again lose those changes when the application reloads. That's because these changes are not persisted to a database table. We'll discuss how to persist these changes to a database table in our upcoming videos. Now let's create a new employee. Notice the panel title is Create Employee. Let's edit an existing employee. Notice now the panel title is Edit Employee. Now let's launch Browser Developer Tools and create a new employee. Notice when I click this Show Preview button without typing anything in the photo path field, we get a 404 error. That's because this is not a valid photo path and this image element is trying to render it. It doesn't make any sense to display this Show Preview button if there is nothing typed in this photo path field. So let's hide this button if there is nothing typed in this field to avoid these unnecessary 404 errors. So within our Create Employee component view template, we have our photo path field right here and the Show Preview button is right here. Now let's include NJF structural directive on this button. We want to display this button only if the photo path property is not equal to an empty string, and it must also should not be equal to null. And let's include these two conditions on the image element that actually renders the photo as well. Notice now when the photo path field is empty, we don't have that button displayed. As soon as I start typing, that's when we see the button. When I type a valid path and when we click Show Preview, we see the image as expected. So there are 3 simple steps to modify Create Employee form to support both creating a new employee and update an existing employee. The first step is to change the Create Route path to include a parameter. Notice we included an ID parameter. We're going to use this parameter to determine if we are using the form to create a new employee or update an existing employee. The next step is to subscribe to route parameter changes and react accordingly from our Create Employee component. If the ID route parameter value is 0, that means we are creating a new employee. If it is any value other than 0, that means we are editing an existing employee. Finally, modify our Angular employee service to create or update an employee depending on whether the ID property value of the employee object is null or not. That's it in this video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.